I knew it was Karen's SUV before the garage door was even halfway open. Same white Escalade. Same crooked HOA decal in the back window. The thing was sitting fully inside my workshop between the lift and my welding table, like somebody had dropped it there overnight and forgotten about it. For a second, I honestly thought maybe one of my customers had moved it as a joke. Then I saw the sticky note taped to the windshield. Needed shade. Thanks, that was the entire message. I just stood there holding a gas station coffee getting dripped on my boot because my hand stopped cooperating for a minute. The side gate had been latched when I left for lunch. Nothing looked broken. She just opened it, driven into a private workspace, parked next to $40,000 worth of equipment, and walked away like she was borrowing a shopping cart. I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. I texted her that her vehicle was inside an active commercial workshop and needed to be removed now cause I had customers coming in that afternoon. About 15 minutes later, she replied, "Running errands. Back later. Don't tow it." That part bothered me more than the parking somehow. Not even an apology. Just instructions. I remember walking around the SUV checking clearances because the front bumper was too close to the compressor cabinet, and if one of my guys had done that, I would have made him reposition it immediately. I kept thinking less about trespassing and more about liability. If somebody tripped around that thing or hit it with a tool, I already knew the conversation was going to become a circus. And the stupid part was I still wasn't convinced the HOA or local police would touch it. Up to that point, every problem involving Karen somehow turned into a neighbor dispute nobody wanted attached to their paperwork. So I locked the shop back up. I don't remember deciding to weld the doors exactly. The machine was already out from earlier work, and after standing there too long, I just started sealing the access points. Not permanently. Just enough that opening the place again would take tools and time. After that, I threw a few things into a duffel bag, called my brother in Colorado, and booked a flight for the next morning. When I came back a week later, people in the neighborhood who normally barely waved at each other were standing outside talking about my workshop like it had turned into some kind of public incident. Before Karen moved in, the HOA mostly operated like background noise. Annoying but survivable. Most people figured out the same thing eventually. Keep things reasonably clean and life stays mostly normal. I spent most of my time in the workshop anyway. The workshop sat behind my house near the alley easement. Detached garage originally. I'd converted it slowly over the years because commercial space nearby got too expensive. Then Karen arrived. I remember the moving truck mostly because traffic backed up halfway down the cul-de-sac, while she argued with two movers about patio furniture placement. She kept saying sightline balance like she was talking about a museum exhibit instead of plastic outdoor chairs. At one point, she made them rotate a potted plant 3 different directions. The guy carrying it finally just stopped and stared at her for a second. Just tired already. About 3 days later, everybody on the street got laminated notices in their mailboxes. Not from the HOA, from Karen. Community Visual Standards Reminder. There were bullet points. One section mentioned garage visibility ratios. Another talked about non-harmonized lawn presentation. Somebody had highlighted acceptable edging depth in yellow marker. Frank across the street taped it to the side of his garbage bin and left it there for a week. Most people laughed it off at first because new residents sometimes came in overly enthusiastic before they figured out nobody actually wanted that level of involvement. Karen didn't really adjust, though. She escalated sideways. A few days after that, the Alvarez family got contacted because their portable basketball hoop was apparently creating recreational congestion visibility near the sidewalk. I only remember the phrase because Mr. Alvarez read it out loud laughing while dragging the hoop farther up the driveway. The kids stopped playing there much after that, though. Things got quieter in little ways. People started adjusting around her in small ways. None of it seemed big enough to fight over by itself. That was the problem. Karen always spoke like somebody had already authorized her to say things. One Saturday, I walked out carrying old brake rotors to the scrap pile and found another laminated notice tucked under my windshield wiper. Visible industrial materials negatively affect neighborhood cohesion. I honestly thought it was a joke somebody made using her template. Then I noticed she was standing across the street watching whether I picked it up. I held the paper up a little and asked if she put it there. She nodded once like we were discussing utility billing. I threw it into the shop trash and went back inside. Later that afternoon, I heard tires crunching near the entrance gate and looked up from the workbench long enough to see her escalate, partially blocking the driveway. Not completely. Just enough that customers would need to squeeze around it awkwardly. She was standing near the sidewalk talking to another neighbor like the SUV wasn't even part of the conversation. I waited a few minutes because I assumed she was unloading groceries or something. Eventually, I walked over and asked if she could move it forward a little since I still had clients coming through. She glanced back at the vehicle. "Oh, I'm only here temporarily." Then she kept talking. She didn't even sound rude when she said it. She sounded confused that the distinction apparently hadn't solved the issue already. She left the SUV there almost 40 minutes. That night, the exterior cameras caught Karen near the workshop entrance. She looked straight at the camera, flipped it off, and walked back home. After the camera incident, I started locking the side gate earlier in the day. Not because I thought Karen was dangerous exactly, more because I got tired of wondering what counted as normal behavior anymore. It was easier just to keep things closed. For maybe a week, nothing happened, or at least nothing obvious. Then, one Tuesday morning, I came outside and found her Escalade angled partly across the gravel entrance to the workshop again. Not enough to completely block access. Just enough that anybody pulling a trailer through the gate would have to stop and reposition. The SUV was empty. I stood there looking at it longer than I probably should have because at first, I thought maybe she'd be back out in 30 seconds. People do inconsiderate things sometimes. You don't immediately assume escalation. I ended up calling one of my customers and asking him to come later because backing into the driveway cleanly wasn't really possible with the SUV sitting there. Karen eventually appeared from farther down the street carrying grocery bags. I told her I needed the entrance clear during business hours. She shifted one bag higher against her arm and said, I've had several people mention increased traffic around here lately, like she was relaying information from some invisible committee. I asked who people were. She shrugged a little and unlocked the Escalade. The thing moved maybe 4 feet forward. A few days after that, I got another HOA email. Community visibility concerns regarding home-operated commercial activity. That was the subject line. No violation attached. No actual action required. Just vague wording about preserving neighborhood consistency and minimizing operational impact. I emailed back asking if someone from the board needed updated permit copies since everything on the property was already approved through the county. Nobody answered for several days. Then Mr. Lewis sent a reply that mostly avoided the question. He said the board was simply attempting to maintain awareness before unnecessary escalation occurred. I read the sentence twice because nobody except Karen seemed to think anything was escalating. Still, I printed updated permits after that and kept them near the office desk inside the shop. Mostly because digging through file cabinets every time a new complaint appeared was getting old. Liam noticed eventually. He came in carrying sheet metal one afternoon and asked why inspection paperwork was spread all over the counter. I told him it was probably easier to keep everything visible at this point. He laughed a little at first. Then he stopped. What exactly does she think happens in here? He asked. I wasn't sure anymore. That same week, Karen started standing outside whenever customers arrived, not confronting them directly, just watching. One delivery driver asked quietly whether the neighborhood required visitor registration. The complaints shifted too. Noise during approved business hours, commercial visibility concerns, hazardous fumes, improper material storage. Nothing serious enough to trigger real action, just enough paperwork to waste time. Frank wandered over an afternoon and said, "People are starting to avoid being outside when she's around. I noticed it after that. Kids rode bikes farther down the block now. Contractors parked around the corner instead of near houses. Conversations ended quicker when Karen appeared walking down the sidewalk holding her phone. Nobody wanted direct conflict, though. They mostly adapted around her. Then she started using community safety for everything. Most of it just meant customer vehicles parked legally near the curb. The next week, county police actually showed up because of a reported noise complaint. The officer checked my permits while Karen stood nearby talking about safety exposure and liability patterns. Eventually, he handed the binder back and said it sounded more like a civil or HOA issue, unless something concrete changed. I figured maybe things would cool off a little. The next morning, I was underneath the lift working on a transmission mount when headlights flashed suddenly across the back wall of the workshop. At first, I thought somebody had accidentally pulled into the wrong driveway. Then I rolled out from under the car and realized Karen had backed the Escalade halfway through the open shop entrance. The rear tires were still outside on the gravel, but the front bumper had crossed into the building far enough that if she kept reversing another few feet, she would have clipped the compressor cabinet beside the lift. I told her she needed to stop bringing the SUV into the shop entrance. She looked genuinely confused for a second, like the problem was my tone more than the vehicle itself. "I'm checking clearance conditions," she said. Then she reversed back out onto the gravel and drove away. No apology, no embarrassment, nothing. At some point, it stopped feeling accidental. A couple days later, I got copied on an HOA thread discussing commercial visibility concerns tied to my property. Somebody had attached photos of customer vehicles parked legally near the curb during business hours. Karen wasn't listed directly in the email chain, but her phrasing was all through it. Operational spillover, residential atmosphere impact, and one line that just said, "It doesn't look right lately." Nobody on the board actually accused me of violating anything. They mostly kept asking whether something might become a problem later. Every conversation felt like answering for things that hadn't happened yet. I started documenting things after that. The complaints kept spreading sideways. Meanwhile, Karen started acting differently around other people too. Before, she mostly sounded overly involved. Now she started sounding injured by resistance itself. I overheard her talking to another neighbor near the mailboxes, saying she felt unsupported in maintaining community standards. A week later, she told the delivery driver she'd been dealing with ongoing hostility from certain residents. That wording spread around quietly after a while. People got careful around her, more cautious than sympathetic. Nobody wanted to become the next situation. Frank stopped arguing with her entirely after she reported his trailer registration sticker to the HOA, even though it was current. He told me it wasn't worth spending emotional energy on somebody who treated every conversation like evidence collection. I knew what he meant. I eventually asked the HOA board to inspect the property and settle the issue. Mr. Lewis showed up 3 days later, looking like he already regretted agreeing to it. He checked permits, looked around the shop, and asked a few vague questions about operating hours. Karen appeared near the entrance with a folder and started talking about liability exposure again. Mr. Lewis mostly nodded. Finally, he said, "I think everyone needs to avoid escalating tensions." That was the entire outcome. After he left, Karen asked whether I had authorization for overnight customer storage. I told her yes. She nodded like she was filing that away anyway. At that point, even minor paperwork started eating entire afternoons. Karen kept escalating sideways while everybody else kept trying not to officially own the situation. Even local police had apparently started categorizing it internally as the ongoing HOA disagreement. One officer finally just told me, "Document interactions if things keep getting weird." Weird. That was apparently the official classification now. The next Friday, I left around noon to grab lunch from a sandwich place about 10 minutes away. The workshop was open because Liam had called out sick and I figured I'd only be gone 20 minutes. When I got back, the side gate was still closed. The workshop looked normal from outside. Then I stepped through the bay entrance and stopped walking. Karen's Escalade was fully inside the building. Not partly through the entrance this time. Fully parked between the lift and the welding table with the engine off and nobody around. I remember looking around the workshop first, even though the Escalade was already sitting right there in front of me. Like maybe Karen was still nearby somewhere, and this would turn into an awkward conversation instead of whatever it had apparently become. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement outside. Just the ticking sound metal makes after the building heats up all afternoon. The SUV was parked straighter this time too, deliberately straight, centered between the lift and the welding table with enough room to open the driver's side door comfortably. That detail irritated me more than it should have. I called her immediately. Voicemail. I called again while walking back outside to check the driveway and side gate. Still nothing. Then I texted, "Your vehicle is inside my workshop. You need to move it now." About 20 minutes passed before she answered. "Oops, don't touch my car." That was the whole message. No explanation. I actually sat down after reading it because suddenly my brain started trying to calculate practical problems instead of emotional ones. Customer pickups, insurance liability, overnight access, equipment clearance. If somebody hit the Escalade accidentally inside the shop, I already knew the entire situation would somehow become my fault administratively. I called Liam. He thought I was joking at first. Then he asked whether police had been called yet. I said not yet. I already knew how that conversation would probably go. Civil issue, neighbor dispute, documentation, delayed follow-up, everybody protecting themselves from ownership. Meanwhile, the Escalade was still sitting inside my building like it paid rent there. She'd been inside long enough to rearrange things comfortably. That bothered me more than it should have. I locked the side gate first. Then I lowered the main workshop door. After that, I stood there looking at the seams around the frame for a minute, while the building settled into evening quiet. The welding machine was already out from earlier work on the Camaro frame reinforcement. Leads still connected, tank half full. I remember thinking this was probably a terrible idea. At least I didn't think it was illegal. The vehicle was still hers. The building was still mine. I wasn't damaging anything. Still felt insane though. I dragged the extension leads toward the front entrance before I could reconsider it too long. The first weld was ugly. Too much hesitation. After that, I stopped trying to make it pretty and just sealed the access points enough that opening the building again would take tools and time. The security cameras caught all of it. At one point, I looked right into one of them because I suddenly realized how insane this would sound later. I also spent half of the night wondering whether I just made my own situation worse legally. Then I went inside the house and packed a duffel bag. Mostly jeans, work shirts, chargers. I forgot toothpaste and didn't realize until the airport the next morning. I called my brother in Colorado while booking the flight. I told him I'd explain everything when I landed. Before leaving for the airport, I checked the camera feeds one last time. The Escalade was still sitting inside exactly where Karen left it. I remember wondering whether I just made the whole situation worse. Then my phone buzzed. "Karen, 3 messages in a row. Why are the doors sealed? Open the building. My vehicle is inside." That was when her panic started. By the time my flight landed in Denver, I had 9 missed calls from Karen. The first voicemail still sounded controlled. The second one didn't. Back in the neighborhood, Karen called police first. Frank told me about it later in pieces because apparently half the street kept drifting outside whenever patrol cars showed up, then pretending they were already doing something else. 2 officers arrived near sunset and spent a while standing outside the workshop while Karen explained the situation with a folder tucked under one arm. At one point, she described the building as shared access adjacent infrastructure. The officers checked the camera footage showing Karen driving through the gate herself earlier that afternoon. After that, the conversation slowed down considerably. Eventually, the older officer said it looked more like a civil issue than an active criminal matter, unless property damage became involved. That was basically the end of it. Karen kept trying to make it bigger. Unsafe confinement, interference, retaliation. The officers mostly repeated document everything. Then they left. Nothing changed. A locksmith refused to cut into the building without owner authorization. Around then, the situation started leaking socially. People slowed down near the workshop. Conversations near mailboxes lasted longer. Someone asked Liam whether the SUV was still inside. He said, "I honestly don't know anymore." Which was true. Karen kept texting meanwhile. I stopped responding. Mostly I spent the weekend with my brother hiking and trying not to check camera feeds constantly. Didn't fully work. By the third day, Karen had apparently started approaching neighbors directly, not yelling usually, more trying to recruit agreement. Nobody openly sided against her. People just became less cooperative around her after a while. Even the neighbors, who thought the welding was ridiculous, didn't seem interested in defending how the Escalade ended up inside the shop. Around day 4, a small local news crew showed up. Karen called it an ongoing property access dispute. Frank told them she parked inside somebody else's workshop and now nobody knows whose problem it is. The clip went online that night. After that, people started calling the workshop the Vault. Then the registration rumor started. I still don't know where it came from. Frank heard one version. Another neighbor heard another. Somebody mentioned unresolved citations from another county. I ignored most of it because HOA gossip mutates fast. Still, Karen stopped driving after that. Hard not to notice when her Escalade was still inside my workshop. By then, even the HOA board sounded exhausted. Mr. Lewis left me a voicemail asking whether I planned on restoring reasonable property access conditions soon because the situation was creating tension throughout the neighborhood. The voicemail never directly mentioned the SUV Karen or welding, just conditions. The next morning, I booked a flight home. Frank texted me before boarding and said Karen had been outside near the workshop again earlier that morning. Apparently, she stayed there almost an hour, just sitting in a folding chair near the gate looking toward the building. The Escalade was still inside exactly where she left it. When I got back home, the neighborhood looked almost normal. Then I turned into my driveway and saw Karen sitting in a folding chair near the side gate. She stood up when she saw my truck. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then she asked very calmly whether I was finally going to resolve the access situation. She looked exhausted, more than angry. I told her I was open in the workshop that afternoon, but I wanted an officer present first, so nobody later claimed property damage or unauthorized entry. She opened her mouth like she was about to argue, then stopped halfway through and just nodded once. That more than anything else made the whole situation suddenly feel real. No speech, no threats, just tired agreement. About an hour later, a county officer arrived. Same older guy from the first visit. He walked around the building once looking at the weld seams and shook his head a little, though I couldn't tell whether he was impressed or irritated. Probably both. Karen stayed near the curb while I cut through the weld points with a grinder. Few neighbors drifted outside gradually while I worked. Not crowds, just people finding reasons to suddenly check mailboxes or water plants. The grinder noise carried farther than I expected. Nobody talked much. When the door finally rolled upward, the Escalade was still sitting exactly where Karen left it, between the lift and welding table. People outside got quiet. Seeing it there made the whole thing harder to turn back into rumor. Karen walked toward the entrance immediately. The officer stopped her before she reached the vehicle and asked whether her registration issue had been resolved yet. She froze for maybe 2 seconds. Then she said she was still handling administrative corrections. The officer asked whether her license status was currently active. Karen didn't answer right away. People outside started looking away from each other at that point. The whole thing suddenly became socially uncomfortable in a different direction. Eventually, the officer told her she couldn't legally drive the SUV until the status issue was cleared up and suggested arranging a tow instead. Karen just stood there staring into the workshop. No yelling. That made it worse. If she'd yelled, people probably would have known what to do with it. She didn't. She just stood there looking smaller than usual. Tow trucks came later that evening. By then, word had spread enough that the next HOA meeting ended up unusually full. I almost didn't go. Liam convinced me mostly because he said if we skipped it, Karen would probably rebuild the entire narrative uncontested. The meeting started awkwardly. Mr. Lewis tried to move through normal agenda items first. Didn't work. Eventually, somebody asked whether the board planned on addressing the vehicle situation. After that, things started sliding sideways pretty fast. People began bringing up smaller incidents that sounded different once everyone heard them together. The Alvarez family mentioned the basketball hoop. Frank mentioned the photos. Someone else said Karen had contacted employers connected to contractor vehicles. Karen kept trying to interrupt with things like context matters, and these were legitimate concerns. But the room wasn't moving with her anymore. Mostly fatigue. At one point, Mr. Lewis asked whether I had documentation related to the workshop complaints. I brought my laptop mostly because Liam insisted, so I connected it to the meeting room projector and pulled up the camera archives. Not edited clips, just timestamps. Karen blocking the workshop entrance. Then the clip of her parking fully inside the workshop alone. Nobody reacted dramatically. People just watched quietly while the incident stopped sounding isolated. Karen tried explaining that temporary access had been implied by prior neighborhood tolerance. Even she sounded tired saying it. Eventually, Mr. Lewis removed Karen from 2 HOA subcommittees pending further review of conduct procedures. Another board member proposed requiring future complaints to include direct evidence instead of informal submissions. Nobody applauded. The meeting just sort of thinned out afterward. Karen stayed seated, staring down at paperwork while people quietly left the meeting. As I walked out, Frank passed me near the entrance and nodded toward the parking lot. Karen was standing beside a tow company sedan waiting for a ride home. not the Escalade. That was still sitting at an impound storage lot pending registration clearance and documentation issues. She looked over once while we were leaving, then looked away again almost immediately. Things settled down slowly after that. Normal neighborhood problems started taking up space again. Kids started playing basketball near the Alvarez driveway again. The HOA meetings got quieter, too. Still annoying. But normal annoying. About a month later, people actually looked relaxed again. Karen stayed another couple months. Mostly she just became harder to see. Curtains closed more often. Fewer complaints. No more stopping people outside. A few weeks later, a moving truck appeared outside her house. No announcement. No dramatic exit. By the weekend, the property was empty. The new couple who moved in brought over cookies and apologized because their dog barked at vacuum cleaners. It was such a normal problem that I almost laughed. I never re-welded the doors after cutting them open. Didn't need to. The side gate still closes a little crooked from where the hinges warped during winter, though. I keep meaning to fix it properly, and then forgetting. People still ask about it sometimes. Honestly, while it was happening, it mostly felt exhausting. People stopped adjusting themselves around her after a while. Things got quieter after that. The welds came off eventually. The side gate still sticks sometimes when it rains. I keep meaning to fix it.